The first thing Daniel Carter noticed about Chicago O'Hare International Airport at night was how wrong the silence felt. Airports were never truly quiet. There was always the low hum of distant machinery, the echo of a far-off announcement, the murmur of unseen voices. But as he stepped inside the deserted terminal for his first night shift, he realized this silence wasn't normal. It was heavy. It pressed against his skin, sinking into his bones, like something was listening. The overhead lights flickered once as he walked through the empty concourse. For a split second, his reflection in the glass didn't move with him. His heart kicked against his ribs, and he shook his head, laughing at himself. He was tired, that was all. Just nerves. A sharp voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "You must be Carter." Daniel turned. A man stood near the security checkpoint, watching him with cold, sunken eyes. His airport ID read Holloway, and his uniform was crisp, pressed too perfectly, like he had just stepped out of a mannequin display. "Yeah, that's me," Daniel said, shifting under the man's stare. Holloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. His expression remained unreadable as he held it out. "Read this carefully. These rules are not a joke." Daniel frowned, but took the paper. The list felt strange in his hands, the paper oddly warm, like someone had been holding it for too long. He unfolded it. His stomach tightened. Rules for the night shift, midnight to 6 a.m. Rule number 1. If you hear knocking from an empty jet bridge, do not open the door. Rule number 2. If you see a plane taxiing in with no scheduled arrival, look away until it disappears. Rule number 3. If you spot a passenger in old clothing wandering alone, do not talk to them. Rule number 4. If a man in a pilot's uniform asks where his flight is, do not answer. Walk away immediately. Rule number 5. If you hear a flight announcement that isn't on the schedule, do not watch the plane land. Rule number 6. Never, under any circumstances, step inside a jet bridge alone after 3 a.m. Rule number 7. If you see your own reflection wave at you, run. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Okay, this is some kind of initiation thing, right?" Holloway didn't laugh. He just stared, his expression flat, unreadable. His fingers twitched slightly, the only sign of movement. "Follow the rules," he said quietly, "or you won't last the night." Daniel's mouth felt dry. Something about the way Holloway said it, the way the words sank into the air like a curse, made his skin prickle. He forced a chuckle. "Come on, man. You expect me to believe this?" Holloway exhaled slowly. "Believe what you want." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But I've worked here 11 years, and I've trained a lot of people." His gaze darkened. "You want to know how many made it through the first week?" Daniel didn't answer. Holloway lifted his hand. He held up 3 fingers. A sharp chill ran through Daniel's spine. The air between them felt thick, suffocating. The silence stretched too long. Then, finally, Holloway stepped back. "Good luck, Carter." And without another word, he turned and walked into the shadows of the terminal, disappearing through an unmarked door. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers were clenched around the warm sheet of paper. He swallowed, shaking off the unease, and stuffed the rules into his pocket. This was ridiculous. Just some creepy workplace tradition to scare the newbies. He looked around the empty airport, the endless rows of chairs, the motionless baggage carousels, the darkened jet bridges. It was just a job. Just another night shift. But as he turned toward the employee entrance, he saw something out on the tarmac. A figure, standing too still under the orange glow of the runway lights, watching him. Daniel blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained. Daniel stood frozen, his breath unsteady, his eyes locked on the empty tarmac where he had just seen something. The air was too still, too heavy, like the airport itself was holding its breath. His fingers twitched at his sides, his pulse a dull, erratic throb in his ears. He tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just seeing things. Maybe the isolation was already getting to him. He turned away, forcing himself to move. The terminal was unnaturally silent as he started his patrol. Rows of empty seats stretched into the dimly lit concourse, the overhead speakers humming with a low, near imperceptible static. The flickering glow of a vending machine cast long, distorted shadows on the polished floor. He tried not to look at them too closely. His footsteps echoed too loudly. Daniel checked the clock on the far wall. 1:12 a.m. He exhaled. Just 5 more hours. Then he saw it. Through the massive airport windows, something shifted on the runway. At first, he thought it was just another plane in the distance. But as his eyes adjusted, his stomach dropped. A plane was taxiing toward the terminal. That wouldn't have been strange, except for one thing. There were no scheduled arrivals. Daniel frowned, instinctively reaching for the small tablet clipped to his belt. He pulled up the schedule, scanned the list twice. Nothing. Every flight that was supposed to land had already arrived hours ago. But the plane was still coming. His pulse picked up, his mind racing through rational explanations. Maybe an unscheduled emergency landing? A test run? A late-night charter flight? But then he noticed something that made the air stick in his throat like tar. The plane was silent. No rumble of jet engines, no mechanical whine of wheels against the runway, just pure, unnatural stillness as it glided toward the gate like a ghost. Daniel's fingers clenched around the tablet. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. A whisper of memory nagged at the back of his skull, something he had read less than an hour ago. Rule number 2, if you see a plane taxiing in with no scheduled arrival, look away until it disappears. His grip on the tablet tightened. His throat was dry. It was just a stupid list, just some weird hazing ritual. He ignored the warning. He kept watching. The plane slid into place at gate 34, its nose perfectly aligned with the jet bridge. Daniel waited for the usual post-landing routine, the shift of lights, the hum of hydraulics, the slow hiss of pressurization adjusting. Nothing happened. The aircraft just sat there, lifeless, a hollow metal shell. Then the door opened. A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the deserted terminal as the boarding door unlatched on its own. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Inside the plane, everything was pitch black. The cabin lights remained off. The aisle was a tunnel of absolute darkness, the seats barely visible in the ambient glow of the terminal. He squinted, his pulse hammering, trying to make out any movement inside. Then, something moved. A shape shifted in the darkness. At first, it was subtle. A flicker, a disturbance in the shadows. Then slowly, something stretched forward. A long, unnatural limb, pale and too thin, its fingers scraping against the seats as it crawled down the aisle. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. The shape emerged further, the dim emergency exit signs casting just enough glow to outline its distorted form. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like its neck had been stretched just a little too far. The fingers dragged along the armrest, slow, deliberate, like it was feeling its way forward. Then, the cockpit lights flickered on. For a single heart-stopping second, Daniel saw the empty flight deck. No pilot, no crew, just vacant seats. The control panels were dark, the instruments lifeless. There was no one flying this plane. Then, a sound crackled over the airport intercom. A voice. Deep, hollow, wrong. "Welcome home, Daniel." His lungs seized, his entire body locked up. The voice hadn't come from the plane. It had come from the ceiling speakers all around him, the intercom system. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. His own name. It had said his name. Daniel stumbled back. His hand hit the security desk, nearly knocking over a stack of paperwork. His breath was coming too fast, too shallow. His mind screamed at him to look away, to stop watching, to run. He blinked. The plane was gone. Gate 34 was empty. No aircraft, no boarding door, no sign that anything had ever been there. But Daniel could still feel it. That heavy, clinging presence. The whisper of something watching. Waiting. His hands shook as he dug the crumpled list of rules out of his pocket. His eyes locked onto rule number 2. If you see a plane taxiing in with no scheduled arrival, look away until it disappears. He hadn't looked away. He turned, forcing himself away from the window, away from the phantom aircraft that had vanished as if it had never existed. His footsteps were quick, uneven, echoing against the vast emptiness of the terminal. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, flickering in irregular pulses. The air was too still. Every inch of his body screamed at him that he was not alone. He told himself he was imagining it. He had to be. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he rounded a corner near gate C-17. That's when he froze. There, standing just feet from the floor-to-ceiling windows, was a woman. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, just stood there, completely motionless. Her back was to him, facing the dark expanse of the runway. Something about her posture was unnatural, stiff and calculated, like she had been placed there rather than having walked in. Her uniform caught his eye first. A vintage Pan Am flight attendant outfit. Crisp blue fabric, neatly pressed, white gloves, perfectly smooth, a matching hat perched atop a head of meticulously styled curls. But something was wrong. Daniel's breath hitched. Her skin looked too smooth. Not a single crease, no pores, no natural imperfections, like porcelain. The dim lighting reflected off her exposed arms in a way that wasn't quite right. And then there were her eyes. Too wide, too round, too unblinking. His fingers dug into the strap of his radio. The air felt thick, heavy. Then she moved. Not a shift, not a natural turn. Her head rotated, slow and precise, as if on a rusted hinge. The motion was wrong, deliberate, as though she was forcing herself to acknowledge him. Daniel couldn't breathe. Her mouth curled into a grin. It stretched too far, the corners of her lips pulling unnaturally high. The expression sat on her face like it didn't belong there, as if she had seen people smile but never quite understood how. His stomach twisted violently. He tried to take a step back, but his legs locked. The rules. He knew this was in the rules. Do not talk to her. His lips pressed into a thin line. He wouldn't. He'd pretend she wasn't there. He'd turn and walk the other way, just like he should have with the plane. He still wasn't sure what had happened to him when he broke that rule, but he wouldn't make the same mistake again. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, too soft, almost melodic. It was wrong, not human. You see them too, don't you? Daniel's lungs seized, his throat closed. He hadn't answered. He hadn't said a word. But somehow, she still knew. A shiver crawled up his spine, like icy fingers pressing into his skin. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to get as far away from her as possible. But he couldn't move. She took a step toward him. It was slow, calculated, her movements precise and deliberate, like something imitating a person, but not quite getting it right. The leather of her shoes barely whispered against the floor, yet the sound sent an unnatural ache into his skull. Daniel clenched his fists. Don't acknowledge her. Don't answer. Don't react. The lights above flickered. For half a second, the terminal was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, she was gone. But the air was thick with something unseen. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots, his body paralyzed with the kind of fear that reached deep, primal and suffocating. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Then a soft exhale. Right behind him, Daniel's entire body locked. The breath was warm, unnervingly close to his neck. She was behind him. His fingers twitched. He couldn't turn around. He knew he shouldn't. The intercom crackled. A garbled voice, distant and wrong, whispered through the speakers. She's still watching. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges. He could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his skull. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the air shifted. The weight lifted. The presence behind him was gone. Daniel staggered forward, his entire body trembling. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the empty terminal. No one was there, but the scent of old perfume lingered in the air, clinging to his skin like an invisible stain. He swallowed hard, his pulse still erratic, his legs unsteady as he forced himself to move. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, to abandon his shift, to walk out of the airport and never come back. But then, his radio crackled to life. The sudden burst of static jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Daniel. His supervisor's voice buzzed through the interference, distorted and uneven. We've got a maintenance request over at Gate A22. Check it out. Daniel exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. Gate A22. That was on the other side of the terminal, far from where the woman where she shouldn't have been. He needed to shake this feeling, regain some sense of control. A maintenance request was normal, routine. This was his job. But as he made his way toward the jet bridge, something gnawed at the edges of his mind. The silence around him felt deeper. The airport had always been quiet during these late shifts, but now it felt drained, hollowed out. Like the very air had been scooped away and replaced with something unnatural. He reached Gate A22. The jet bridge loomed ahead, extending from the empty terminal to the waiting aircraft, like a passageway into something unknown. The closer he got, the colder the air became. It wasn't just the usual airport chill, it was something else entirely, something that seeped into his bones. His breath came out in small, visible puffs. It shouldn't be this cold. Daniel hesitated at the entrance to the jet bridge. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows. His radio was too quiet. No background static, no usual hum of the airport systems. Just dead air. He stepped forward. The bridge creaked beneath his weight, the sound stretching through the silence like something ancient groaning in protest. The moment he reached the plane's entrance, the sensation hit him like a wave. The air inside felt wrong. It was heavy, dense, pressing against his skin like an unseen weight. The cabin lights were dim, flickering erratically. The seats stretched out before him in eerie, perfect silence. No hum of machinery, no distant echo of life beyond the fuselage, just stillness. Then he saw him. A man sat motionless in seat 13B. Daniel's stomach dropped. The passenger's head was tilted forward, his face obscured beneath the brim of a faded pilot's cap. His posture was too stiff, too rigid, like a mannequin placed into position. A slow, pulsing dread crawled up Daniel's spine. The plane was supposed to be empty. He took a step forward, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Sir?" No response. The man's fingers twitched against the armrest. A single, unnatural jerk. Daniel's fingers clenched around his radio. He tried again, louder this time. "Sir, this aircraft is out of service. You're not supposed to be here." Silence. Then the fingers moved again. Not a normal twitch, not a nervous habit. They began tapping. Too fast, too erratic, an unnatural rhythm, inhumanly quick. The sound was wet, the flesh slapping against plastic in a way that made Daniel's stomach churn. The air grew heavier. Then, his radio burst to life. A voice crackled through the static, but it wasn't his supervisor. It wasn't anyone he recognized. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper slithered through the speaker, layered, distorted. Too many voices at once, overlapping in a grotesque harmony. Daniel's blood ran cold. The man in seat 13B lifted his head. Daniel froze. The face beneath the pilot's cap was wrong. His eyes were hollow, not empty sockets, not the absence of eyes, but something worse. A void, a deep, endless darkness stretched beyond where a human face should be, an abyss so vast it seemed to pull the light into it. The longer Daniel looked, the more he felt himself slipping. Something moved inside those voids. Something shifted. The radio let out a sharp, piercing shriek. The overhead intercom crackled. A voice, warped guttural, echoed through the empty plane. Final boarding call. Daniel's breath hitched. The plane door slammed shut, on its own. The sound reverberated through the cabin, final and absolute. Daniel's paralysis snapped. He ran. His feet pounded against the carpeted aisle, every fiber of his being screaming to get out, get out, get out. The seats seemed to shift around him, the walls of the plane, narrowing, the flickering lights casting unnatural shadows that moved when they shouldn't. He reached the door and yanked at the handle. Locked. The air behind him shifted. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The whisper came again, directly in his ear. "You're already on board." A hand clamped onto his shoulder. Daniel screamed. His body jerked violently as he twisted away, but there was nothing there. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides like unseen hands trying to pull him under. His breath came in ragged gasps as he slammed his fists against the locked plane door. The whisper curled through the darkness behind him. "You're already on board." The floor beneath his feet lurched. A deep, guttural creak shuddered through the plane, and for one horrifying second, Daniel felt as if the aircraft were moving. The rows of seats seemed to stretch endlessly, distorting, twisting, the space bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Then a click, the door unlocked. Daniel stumbled out, crashing onto the jet bridge. He barely registered the moment the plane's door slammed shut behind him, sealing whatever horror lurked inside. His limbs trembled as he scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. He wasn't safe, not yet. He needed to get out of this terminal, away from this place, from this thing that had been following him. But then he saw it. At gate F9, a door stood ajar, just slightly, enough for a sliver of darkness to bleed into the hallway. Daniel's stomach knotted. The rule, the one he always ignored. Never go inside a jet bridge alone after 3 a.m. If you hear whispers, run. He hadn't heard anything, not yet. But as he took an instinctive step backward, his radio buzzed to life. It wasn't static this time. It was voices, soft, faint, slithering through the air like something wet and rotten. Daniel, stay, one more trip, one last flight. His name twisted through the whispers, layered voices overlapping, weaving together in an unnatural, sickly melody. The sound made his skin crawl, like something thin and spindly was brushing against his eardrums. Daniel's entire body screamed at him to leave, but the door was open. A creeping, nauseating curiosity clawed at him. He had spent years working these shifts, seeing things he wasn't supposed to see. And this rule had always felt different, stronger, more absolute. He should run. He should. Instead, he stepped inside. The air changed instantly. It was wrong. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the jet bridge stretched, not just longer, endless. The far exit, where the plane should be, was gone, swallowed by a yawning abyss of blackness. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in slow, unnatural waves. The floor beneath him wasn't carpet anymore. It felt soft, almost like flesh. The door behind him slammed shut. Daniel spun around. No handle, no way out. And then, something moved in the darkness ahead. A shape, thin, tall, limbs too long, bones pushing against sickly, stretched skin. It didn't walk. It glided. And as it did, the whispers grew louder. One more trip, one more flight, just one more. Daniel's breath hitched. The shape tilted its head, and then a cold, skeletal hand shot out of the shadows, grabbing his wrist. Daniel choked on a scream. The fingers wrapped around his skin like ice, pressing so hard he felt the bones grinding together. His entire arm went numb. He tried to pull away, but it held tight, nails or claws digging deep into his flesh. The whispering voices swelled, overlapping, pushing into his skull, flooding his mind with static and something else. Memories. Memories that weren't his. He saw a flight attendant, decades ago, stepping onto the same jet bridge, her smile frozen in place as she vanished into the endless dark. He saw a pilot, uniform pristine, knocking on the cockpit door of a plane that had never taken off. He saw passengers, row after row of them, sitting in a plane that didn't exist, faces blank, eyes hollow, waiting for a flight that would never land. The thing in the darkness tightened its grip. Daniel's vision blurred. His knees buckled, the weight of the air pressing against his skull. He was going to disappear, just like the others. But then, he ripped free. With a strength fueled by sheer animalistic terror, he wrenched himself out of the thing's grasp and lunged toward the door. His shoulder slammed into the metal, and by some impossible stroke of luck, it gave way. He staggered out, barely catching himself as the door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, panting, drenched in cold sweat, his entire body trembling. His wrist burned. He didn't dare look down, didn't want to see what kind of mark that thing had left on him. Then something caught his eye. The glass window beside the jet bridge reflected his own face, pale, shaken, his uniform soaked through with sweat. But something was wrong. His reflection wasn't standing still. It lingered for just a second too long, and then it turned and walked away. Daniel's stomach dropped. He stood frozen, watching as his reflection moved deeper into the jet bridge, vanishing into the dark. He was still in there. His own body stood motionless, a cold sweat crawling down his spine. He could still feel it, something unnatural, something wrong, watching him from inside. But there was no time to process it. His radio crackled violently, a sudden burst of static screaming through the speaker. His hands trembled as he grabbed it. "Control, this is Daniel at F9, he rasped, his voice barely steady. "Something's wrong, I need..." The radio cut out. Silence. Then, a click, and a voice that was not human. It was glitching, like broken audio distorting between pitches, words stretching and snapping in on themselves. But beneath the static, something whispered. "They know you see them." Daniel's stomach dropped. The air around him grew heavier, as if unseen hands were pressing against his ribs, squeezing the breath from his lungs. "You broke the rules." A slow, unnatural creaking echoed through the terminal. "Leave before the final flight arrives." The intercom above crackled to life. Every speaker in the terminal buzzed with a deep, resonating hum vibrating in his bones. Then, now arriving, Flights 666. The terminal went silent. Daniel felt his heartbeat slam against his chest. His eyes darted to the empty schedule board. No flight was supposed to be arriving now. Nothing. Yet outside, beyond the terminal's towering glass windows, the sky shifted. Something massive was descending onto the runway. Daniel knew he shouldn't look. The rule, the last one. If you hear a flight announced that isn't on the schedule, do not watch it land. He clenched his jaw, his hands digging into his sides, forcing himself to turn away. But the air was wrong, thick and humming with a frequency he could feel in his skull. The glass rippled. A shadow stretched across the tarmac, long, shifting, unnatural. Not the shape of a plane. Not anything he could understand. His ears popped. Then a low groan reverberated through the airport like metal twisting in protest. The lights flickered. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't look. He wouldn't. But then the whispering began. Soft, insidious, crawling from every direction at once. See it, see it, see it. His body tensed, every nerve screaming to run, but something moved behind him. A reflection. The terminal windows weren't just glass anymore. They were mirrors. Daniel saw himself, except it wasn't him. The figure staring back at him in the warped reflection was smiling. A slow, stretched grin. Its eyes were black, hollow, starving. Daniel whipped around. The airport was empty, yet the reflection remained. The whispers swelled. A chorus of voices, overlapping, as if thousands of mouths were speaking through his own mind. His own name curled through them, over and over. Daniel, Daniel, come see the last flight land. The urge to turn, to look, was overwhelming. It crawled into his thoughts, pushing against his skull like fingers digging into soft clay. Outside, something shifted on the runway. The silhouette of Flight 666 loomed. The world vibrated. The windows bulged outward, bending as if the airport itself was breathing. Daniel clenched his fists, shoving the whispers out. He wouldn't look. He couldn't. Then, footsteps, right behind him. Slow, deliberate. The air turned ice cold. His breath hitched as a voice whispered against his ear. You've been chosen. Daniel ran, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air behind him thickened, pressing against his back like invisible hands reaching, grabbing. The whisper that had just coiled around his ear still echoed inside his skull. You've been chosen. The airport warped. The overhead lights flickered violently, casting elongated, shifting shadows that shouldn't have been moving. The glass windows pulsed like living tissue, stretching inward as if something was trying to push through. And then, the sound, a deafening, hellish roar tore through the air. Not the sound of a normal jet engine, but something else, something alive. A wail of anguish and hunger, layered with countless voices screaming in agony. Daniel skidded to a halt, his breath hitching. Outside, on the tarmac, it landed. The plane was monstrous, impossibly large. Its body twisted and writhed, shifting between forms as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The metal of its fuselage breathed, pulsing like veins beneath pale skin. The cockpit windows were black hollows, emptier than space itself. The intercom crackled overhead, but this time it didn't glitch. Final boarding call. Daniel Carter, please proceed to gate F9. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. They had called his name. A deep vibration rumbled beneath his feet, as if the entire airport was reacting to the arrival of this thing. Then, movement. The passengers from the vanished plane were emerging from the gate. Their bodies were wrong. Elongated shadows draped over fragile, withering forms. Their heads lulled unnaturally to the side, faces twisted into open-mouthed, silent screams. Eyes hollow, dark voids, just like the thing in seat 13B. They swayed as they walked, their steps synchronized in a slow, unnerving rhythm. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. No, no, no. He turned to run, but froze. Mr. Holloway was standing at the gate, watching him. The older man's face was ashen, his expression grim, tired. He shook his head, his mouth set in a firm, knowing line. You should have followed the rules. Daniel whipped around. The jet bridge was open, leading to the waiting plane. The thing was waiting. The whispering returned, curling around him, inside him. One flight, Daniel. Just one more flight. Something grabbed his wrist. Cold, bony, wrong. Fingers like steel clamps dug into his flesh, pulling him toward the bridge. More hands joined, grasping at his arms, his legs. The shadow passengers descended upon him, wordless, their open mouths stretching wider, wider. He screamed, thrashing, kicking, fighting against the impossible grip. The jet bridge stretched endlessly ahead, yawning into an abyss of shifting metal and pulsing darkness. The lights inside pulsed, beating like a heart. Daniel's vision blurred as the hands yanked him forward. The whispering grew deafening, a million voices crawling inside his head, pushing him to let go, to give in, then darkness. A stillness so complete it felt like the world had ceased to exist. And then, a beep. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was sitting at his desk. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the terminal screen glowing in front of him. The clock read 11:59 p.m. 1 minute before his shift started. The radio was silent. The terminal was still. The airport looked normal, but Daniel knew. His breath shuddered out of him as he slowly turned his head toward the glass window overlooking the gates. The jet bridge at gate F9 was open, waiting, and this time there was no way out.